Welcome everybody. For those I don't know, I think I do know everyone in the room, but for those who don't, I'm Paul Russ, I'm the Artistic Director at Dance 4. Welcome to session 3 in a series of conversations, A Place to Dance, where we muse really on where dance and choreographic practices now sit, where they're placed, and somehow having a discussion around what lies ahead for dance and choreographic practices. What this session is particularly focused on is a collaborative project that Dance 4 and Middlesex University worked on with funding from the Arts and Humanities Research Council by being able to support 2 studentships explore 2 very interesting and particularly pertinent questions around their own individual practices and relationship to choreography and audiences, and also relationship to Dance 4, its particular practices around mock dance. What we're going to do this evening is hear from both of those students, well, now successful doctors, hurrah, about their research and the knowledge that's been developed through those projects. So firstly we're going to hear from Rosanna Irvine, and then we're going to hear from Sara Giddens. Then we'll take a short pause, and then we'll have a conversation between myself, Sara and Rosanna, and Vida Vigilo, professor from Middlesex University, and we were part of the supervision of the collaborative project. So I'm not going to talk for any longer, I'm just going to hand over to Rosanna.
So hello. I'm going to talk about the PhD project that I undertook, and one particular aspect of that was that it would address an aspect of the legacy of Dance 4. And another particular aspect was that it would address that through creative practice as well as through written outcomes. So I'll be talking about those 2 aspects, about my own creative works, 2 of them, and the written thesis. The 2 choreographic works are Perception Frames, which is a collection of choreographic scores, and the other work is a performance installation called What Remains and Is to Come, which is performed in gallery spaces with audience moving through. And this is a document of that work, which is not really part of the PhD, but it's a book with images, text and scores from it. And imagine also a tome of 65,000 words, written commentary and transcribed interviews. This is the written thesis. What's coming up on this screen behind you will repeat, so you can sort of let it wash over you for now. And we'll begin. So during the research, I've talked a lot with lots of people connected to Dance 4. Directors, producers, office managers, one the whole time, Rachel Emmett, and more. And also lots of artists who've worked with Dance 4, and I've worked with many artists in the development of my own work. Those people are part of the research. Their contribution is tangible. Their names are scrolling here in recognition of that. I'll give an overview of the project, and I'll do that by answering some big picture questions. One way that the words artists and researcher were brought together within this project was through my being called a research artist. I'd say the first thing that happens is perhaps a whole lot of different ideas about what research artists might mean. As an artist, I can identify 2 obvious ways that research operates in my practice. The first, which may be shared by many of you here, I know there are artists among you, is that serious creative endeavour is a mode of research. It's a looking into a sort of unknown, an act of inquiry. The second way, which isn't separate from that first, and which may be familiar to you all too, is that research operates in the following through of specific concerns within the creative endeavour. The first of these, the creative endeavour, may at times operate in a kind of immediacy or immersion or action. The second is reflective, considered, and in a sense discursive. It involves understanding arts activity within particular historical, cultural contexts. As research artists, making art as part of the art world, you make work through the research concerns that you have, and you show the work in public contexts. With the involvement of an academic world, you're entering into a world of commentary, and an involvement with what other commentators have said before, and you're required to take a position as a commentator. Performance scholar Susan Melrose has said that what happens in university theatre and performance departments tends to be spectator studies. This is a commentary from the perspective of watching, commentary about the object of creative production. The perspective I take as commentator is different. In writing on art as part of the academic world, I write about the specific research concerns. I talk about how those concerns operate in the making and performing of work. I write about the ways that the creative processes undertaken are in themselves research, which brings me to the concerns that operate for me in the creative endeavour. Over the last few years, my concerns have been around philosophical and political questions to do with relational aspects of choreographic structures and about compositional methods that are generative rather than preset. These concerns have led me to an investigation into modes and qualities of thinking within choreographic practice. Writing in the context of an academic world, I'm required to say more about this than I might choose to as an artist researcher. Or perhaps it's more accurate to say that I'm required to be more specific in terms of my commentary. There's not a clear-cut distinction between art world and academic world in terms of the commentary that they work with. But there are issues around the expectations of an academic world when it comes to commentary. I've been using the word commentary so far, but we could also say theory. And theorizing is a practice, a different practice to arts practice. It involves using words to develop ideas, often piggybacking on earlier ideas. The challenge as an artist entering the academic world is to find ways of theorizing that stay close to the arts practice, that don't reduce arts practice to the illustration of a set of written theories from a different domain of knowledge. There are also questions around the valuing of discourse within the art world, and specifically the dance world. British dance has lagged behind European practices, which since the 1990s has seen a surge in discourse on dance and performance, often led by organisations that are independent of academic contexts. A challenge as a research artist operating in arts and academic worlds is to locate discourse as an activity of the dance world. Viewed in the best possible light, there's mutual benefit going on when discourse goes both ways. The academic world gets to value creative practice through discourse that relates directly to making and performing choreography, distinct from viewing it. The dance world, which would involve producers, curators, agencies, which of course Britain is very much, dance infrastructure is very much organised through dance agencies across the country. So when I say dance world, I mean all the workers as well as the artists. So the dance world also gets to value the research drives and conceptual concerns of choreographers. So now we get to the particulars of a research artist within a dance organisation. Well, first of all, as a particular artist, in this case me, and a particular organisation, Dance Floor. As a research artist at Dance Floor, I have worked with my own particular history and interests, and with Dance Floor's particular history and interests. Earlier, I talked about my interest in modes and qualities of thinking, and I kind of say it like that, thinking, in choreographic practice. And perhaps I should say straight away that thinking isn't necessarily thinking in words. When I'm talking about thinking in choreographic practice, I'm talking about moving, attention, qualities of presence in the activity of choreographic practice. But it's more specific than that. Philosopher Gilles Deleuze has suggested that representation troubles Western notions of what it means to think. He has also suggested that recognition is the first step towards representation, and that so-called thinking often operates through recognition to reproduce what is already known. And I turn this critique he has of representation in Western philosophy to dance and choreography. I'm interested in conditions that force choreographer and performer thinking in ways other than through recognition, which I call the thinking in a non-representational register, a thinking that can generate choreography. These interests are conceptually orientated and experimental. The words conceptual and experimental are associated with dance floor. It was Dance Floor who introduced European conceptual dance to British dance audiences from 1999. Dance Floor continues to program conceptually orientated work since then, and Dance Floor also continues to assert its role as a dance organisation that supports experimentation. The research project that I developed kind of embraces this evident affiliation of interests. The first conceptual dance to be programmed at Not Dance was Jerome Bell. I take this piece as a departure point in my research. I draw on work programmed in Not Dance after the piece to Jerome Bell and my own work, developed during the period of the PhD, to propose a novel articulation of a development in conceptual dance. A novel articulation, a new way of saying something, of explaining something, a proposition. What I talk about is a genealogical extension in the field of conceptual dance, a non-representational poetics. To get there, I started by gathering information. I looked at Not Dance programming, past and present, had conversations with people who worked at Dance Floor, and in particular through an interview with Jane Greenfield, who was artistic director of Dance Floor in the early days from 1993 to 2004. One thing Jane talked about was what an amazing place Nottingham was in the 1990s. Its significance in terms of the rise of the performance and live art scene in the UK is now well recognised. Nottingham was a place in which it was possible for a dance organisation to take the risk of introducing work that was radically different from mainstream British dance. I decided to focus on the period of Jane Greenfield's tenure, from the date of the first programming of conceptual dance in 1999 until she left in 2004. This was the period that, in a sense, established Dance Floor's position in the UK dance sector. Eventually, I selected 3 works from that period. It's significant that each is a text. They are the score for Scribe's Book by Thomas Lehmann, the General Rules score for Project by Xavier Leroy, and Fiona Templeton's text for Invisible Dances by Bock and Vincenzi. So they are German, French, and UK-based choreographers. Each of these texts contains processes. So when you read the texts, you're involved in process, in a sense. Processes that are activated when the text is read or otherwise worked with, for example, when the score is carried out. I saw these texts as generative modes of choreography and wanted to investigate if or how they contributed to non-representational poetics. I carried out interviews with Frank Bock, Simon Vincenzi and Fiona Templeton for Invisible Dances, with Peter Shenson, who choreographed a version of Scribe's Book, which was performed at Not Dance, and I drew from existing interviews with Lehman and Leroy. I worked with 17 other artists in a research workshop to reactivate Leroy's The General Rules Score for Project, and this unexpectedly was the beginning of the research that led to Perception Frames, a strand which involved several more research workshops with groups of artists. Another strand was collaborative dialogue in my own practice. I worked with choreographer Katrina Brown, bringing to that dialogue a concern towards non-representational producing, and this led to the work What Remains and Is to Come. Through all this, I developed an account of conditions for non-representational poetics. As I use the term, poetics means ways of making and performing choreography from the perspective and experience of choreographer and performer. Earlier I talked about my research concerns being to do with conditions that force choreographer and performer thinking in ways other than through representational modes that are based on recognition. And I call this non-representational thinking. It's not intended to be in opposition to representation, but rather a way of operating that is other than through what is already known, other than through what is recognizable in thought in the moment of its occurring. I'm interested in how non-representational thinking can generate choreography, how it can function on the part of choreographer and performer in the making and performing of works. What I found is that a non-representational poetics operates through the activation of specific, constrained, and open relational processes. The constraining is on choreographer and performer thinking, or we might say how their attention is given. Implicit here is that thinking or giving attention is an activity in mind and body. It involves action. Within this, the performer has agency. Her thinking is independent of an intended outcome, including perhaps what the choreographer might be asking for in any specific way. Her thinking isn't aiming at something specific. She must think within the constraint that's set up in order to act. So there's a specific constraint that forces a thinking in order for action to arise, choreographic action to arise, and because of the necessity that the performer acts through agency rather than the will of the choreographer, there is an openness of outcome. The whole context involves open, specific, constrained, and relational. But the relational aspect is not about a relation between. It's about something arising in the activation of a relational process. The written thesis discusses how a non-representational poetics operates in 3 works programmed in Not Dance and in the 2 works that I have made. And it takes off from Jérôme Bell's Jérôme Bell, the first conceptual dance works we programmed at Not Dance. I'll attempt to give a very condensed version of it here. The piece Jérôme Bell by Jérôme Bell has been called a critique of representation by several scholars in the field of dance. I say that Bell's piece, Jérôme Bell, exposes and makes perceptible to audiences the processes of theatrical representation. It troubles representation. It performs its critique of representation while operating within systems of representation. And part of this is that the performers are Bell's representatives. They act for Bell to deliver his critique. I say that Scribe-Stroke shifts from Bell's critique. It exposes the structural processes of a system that is not representational. Scribe-Stroke, written piece by Thomas Lehman, is a detailed score for performance. 3 choreographers work independently from each other and from Lehman, each with 3 performers, to develop a particular version of the score. In performance, 3 versions are presented together in the form of a simple canon. Performed in this way, the structural processes of its production are made visible as the work. So this is distinct from the content that's occurring within this, within the performances. The choreographers and performers who create versions of Scribe-Stroke are not representatives of Lehman. They are agents in a system that he has authored. Scribe-Stroke has 29 themes with corresponding instructions for actions. For the theme dying, which you'll see in a moment, the instruction is to perform movement related to dying. It's evident that this type of instruction invites a representational mode of engagement on the part of the performer. Her thinking is inevitably orientated towards an idea, even if playfully and ironically so, of dying. However, the performer's representational actions carried out in fulfillment of the score function neither as failures of representation nor as critiques of representation. Here, their representational engagement, moving as if dying, functions in a system that's not representational, and the performer self-reflexively knows this. They're aware that the other versions are happening alongside, a few moments after or a few moments before, so that the processes of this structure are revealed, the differences are revealed, rather than the content itself of this action as if I'm really dying or acting. This potentially makes possible a quality of feeling in which a sense of the importance of selfhood is disavowed, since individual expression is not, as it were, the point. Scribe-Stroke deals with the structural level of choreographic making. It moves towards non-representational modes of working as it orientates participants' engagement, so performers' engagements, away from signification and the importance of individual actions towards structural operations. What remains and is to come is a collaborative dialogue between myself and Katrina Brown. Collaborative dialogue is a research method in which we agree to bring our interests and concerns, but that we do not bring a particular theme. We agree to dialogue, to work together and with the materials of our practice, and to make something together, without knowing in advance what that something might be. It is a method identified by me in the early stages as perhaps capable of contributing productively to a non-representational impetus. A method that might facilitate the eluding of foundational approach, and so one that concurs with the philosophical trajectory of the research inquiry. What came through this method was, and the particular collaboration with Katrina Brown, was a close attention to our own tendencies, habits and desires, and also noticing how materials which we work with, paper, charcoal, can be treated as tools for those desires. This can be very subtle, including how hand-eye coordination tends to operate to guide the movement of the hand that holds the charcoal, and so doing to aim for a particular outcome. We gave up holding charcoal in the hand and became increasingly aware of the actions that the materials in relations performed. so the materials and relations, paper, charcoal, body, and also breath. Questions of non-human agency operating with human agency was now in the mix. This gradually led to a systematic method of accumulating material relations between body, breath, paper, and charcoal. The performance installation is a systematic activation of incrementally increasing stages of intra-relational material processes. Within this, agency on the part of human and non-human elements is operative. While Scribesbook exposes the structural processes of a system, what remains in is to come systematically, distinct from being a system, it systematically exposes the processual operations, the processes of material interrelations. Processes that constitute the coming into being of the work. So it's through these processes, material processes being activated, that the work comes into being. For example, what you're seeing now it happens at one point in the performance when more and more charcoal has become embedded in the paper. And then the body touches this embedded charcoal and a mark is left. So there's a gradual continuing accumulation of materials becoming more and more intra something. In project, game playing is presented as choreography. The general rule score, which recalls processes undertaken in a development project, contains instructions for processes to enter into with others to make games and rules for a choreographic event. I undertook a reactivation of the score with 17 participants creating 5 games over 4 days and performing them on the final day. This score forced a situation in which social processes of decision-making arose collectively through a concern towards the logic of gameplay, a logic that would work to move a game forward, that was concerned with playfully setting goals and setting difficulties in achieving the goals through rules that made sense in a game sense, and that then generated a choreography of sorts. A shared sense of an emerging to the situation logic functioned within the group, and very quickly, as a modus for thinking, to constrain thinking at an individual and collective level without predetermining what was possible in the composing activities. The individual experienced herself thinking with others in and for the situation. And this was something that was shared by the whole group, in the sense that the decisions were formed, they arose. The game compositions, the game choreographic structures were made together without someone having an idea for it. They arose through this continual investigation into the logic of game. This was a constructing in relations, not through relational exchange, but in the event of relations, and I suggest a non-representational way of making. In performing the games, a competitive aspect came forward at times, driven by the goal of winning, bringing with it habitual movement and reaction. In some games, the competitive element was quietened, and qualities of sensing into an activity was brought forward. This was an important moment in the research. In particular, what was noticed was that when the performer's perceptibility to her perception was enhanced, that this can function to keep recognition and reaction at bay, and to maintain a quality of thinking in immediacy and mutuality of thinking and action. It is this aspect that I brought forward in the development of perception frames. I say that Bocca Vincenzi's Invisible Dances is constructed through an ongoing embedding of perceptual sensing processes through time, and that with Fiona Templeton's text, it implicates the reader into those processes. Templeton's text is a transcription of her spoken account of a 2-hour performance at which she was the sole audience member. Templeton had been charged with telling a future audience what she was seeing. Templeton's voice would be their means of access to the work, and became the content of the piece Invisible Dances from Afar, a sound work for the telephone. Later, and unplanned at the time of the sound work, Templeton's text was transcribed for the book publication. Templeton is required to watch and give an account simultaneously. Her attention is constrained in a mutuality of sensing, seeing, and acting, speaking. The performers she is watching are also constrained in a mutuality of sensing and acting. Through long research, Bocca Vincenzi developed a movement repertoire that is not based on steps, but in an immersion in perceptual sensing. An example is abandoned body material, which was part of the repertoire. Performers wear earphones, in which they individually and randomly hear composed scores of interior body noises. The instruction is, when a sound begins, fall with the sound into the interior space of the body, to just go. And they worked for actually years with this investigation in perception and investigation of abandoning to the inner space of the body. Bach describes the experience of this as being just caught, of being taken. The perceptual sensing processes that Bocca Vincenzi composed are embedded in an ongoing manner in the construction of Invisible Dances. There are many other layers of embedding that in this brief introduction I can't discuss. The embedding means that each new party to the work is constrained in her thinking and action in part by these earlier processes. So for example, Fiona Templeton is watching the performers immersed in this interior body state of falling and then stopping, listening, and when the sound goes again they go. It's a puzzle for her in her seeing. This immersion in perceptual sensing in terms of the performers and in terms of Templeton, who's doing this talking over 2 hours while observing mysterious actions and charged to keep on talking, to not give in to tiredness. This immersion in perceptual sensing staves off modes of thinking that are associated with recognition and for the performer and Templeton and others in the project, and brings an enhanced sense of action arising unbidden in the immediacy of what is being attended to. In perception frames, perceptual sensing processes are presented as an invitation, as processes to be entered into and to be modified by each artist who works with them. Perception frames seeks to offer situations for practice and performance that are open, so indeterminate with regard to outcome, and specific with regard to the constraining of attention in an immediacy of sensing and perceiving. I mentioned earlier about the research workshop, the Xavier Leroy General Rules School workshop, when I noted that when performers' perceptibility to her perception was enhanced, that it staved off automatic and reactive action. It brought forward a quality of thinking in the immediacy and mutuality of thinking and action. Leading on from that, I undertook a series of public research workshops that investigated approaches to constraining thinking through the framing of perception. More than 40 people contributed by participating in workshops, through discussion and through testing the scores in their development. The scores and perception frames delineate certain constraints for entering into perceptual sensing processes. These processes operate through qualities of thinking that call on a mutuality of sensorial and mindful attention in each moment. The challenge that the scores propose to the performer is to work with an attentive mind and sensing body simultaneously in an experiential non-separation of mind and body experiencing action occurring. The activity of perceptual sensing is orientated through a receptive mode of active awareness in and towards each particular and always different situation of working. Performer attention is constrained, harnessed by the contours of the frame in the immediacy of the event. This is a quality of thinking, a forcing of thinking that is not recognizing. Foregrounding the qualitative aspect of experience, the scores orientate in an immediacy of perceptual attention, such that, in their activation, they engender a choreographic producing. In this way, their operations are those of a non-representation of poetics. The scores are all written, and it includes a glossary. The glossary at the back is intended to be also part of the instructions for the score. I identify dance score's significance in the UK dance sector, in particular through its supporting of European conceptual choreography from 1991 and continuing to support conceptual dance, and doing this prior to the work has become accepted in the London programming circuit. Significance of Nottingham is also highlighted with the existence of the Nottingham Group, the Now Festival, the burgeoning live art scene, contributing to an environment in Nottingham in the 1990s that welcomed experimentation in dance, and where there were artists who shared concerns with the conceptual dance movement and audiences who bought the work. Jane Greenfield's getting of that work and her ambition to grow the festival internationally, linking not dance to new currents in Western dance, bringing these currents to the UK, established dance for its distinctiveness in the UK dance sector. The artistic directors who followed Jane, Nikki Malloy, with Ava Martinez as creative producer, stepping into her shoes temporarily after Nikki left, and then Paul Ross, following Nikki Malloy, have all in their own way continued the direction that Jane established, and dancefloor continues to be a distinctive presence in UK dance. Well, maybe a more fruitful generation of discourse in universities, one that doesn't lean so much towards spectating, reading, and analysing works. One that seeks to understand or articulate the theoretical capacities of art works in terms of art activity. One that opens out the conceptual drives of the artists. And maybe dance in the UK could begin to catch up with visual art in its understanding of its history, of precedence, of lineage, that we're coming from somewhere, and through this that the art form can mature. That theory or language discourse might dominate would be not so good. That what can be said becomes louder than the activity of making art would not be so good. Here there is an argument for organisations that are independent of academic institutions being active in facilitating and generating of discourse. And that's not to say to work separately from them, but to generate it from an independent from academic context. And that is beginning to happen in the UK dance sector, which this series, A Place to Dance, illustrates. Thank you.
Close your eyes and listen.
What? Yes.
Listen.
No? Yes. Here.
Listen.
What? And back again. Yes. To the world. Yes. Her. Here. All over again. Here. Now, nowhere. And the world. Now, here. Stirrings. And on. All's yet to do. And be. And forth and on.
It's a city with a well-renowned reputation for running things smoothly. But it's also a place with a secret.
Yes. So much to do today, here, now, and on. Another day, another. So up and out and off and on you go. Yes. Into the world, gathering its cells up and expecting under the bright sun and on. From nothingness we have come to this. Inklings. And back again at every close to the teeming, into the forming, all darkness once again.
On the equator means it sits happily in perpetual sunshine.
And now again today, this day, and ready to say yes. To mix your fullness with the entirety of the world to come.
Strong economic base, secure financial system, and stable political leadership. It is extremely well positioned to bounce back quickly when
open your eyes. Open your eyes. Yes. Refresh and on and forth and out the energizing darkness. There comes me. Wide awake, right around the corner, just when you least expect. $9.49. Coffee. Yes. Morning.
Through voiceover, Tony Yo offers an invitation to the gathered audience to stop a while in the early morning commute and listen. I have framed this presentation around a series of invitations. The clip comes from the beginning of the first iteration of Dreamwalk. The audience followed two performers through the busy streets of Singapore on a performance walk, stopping at various points along the way, listening through individual earpieces to live and pre-recorded sounds and texts. Choreographed in 2009, working with my company Bodies in Flight and my long-term collaborator, writer Simon Jones, this was our 16th professional work together. I had just completed a 2-year part-time bursary entitled Articulating Dance with Choreographic Lab, led by Jane Bacon and Vida Mitchell. Having brought Dreamwalk back to Nottingham, invited by Dance 4 to be part of Not Dance, an email came through from a dance mailbase outlining the opportunity to apply for a fully funded AHRC studentship hosted by Dance 4 and Choreographic Lab. Such an invitation arrested me and then overwhelmed me, so I deleted it. By 2010, I was busy making the performance walk for Bristol as part of Mayfest. A friend resent me the studentship email. I deleted it. Another friend sent it to me. I finally applied. I was not seeking such an opportunity. In fact, I could have so easily have not made the time or had the confidence even to apply. But it was this particular studentship, the opportunity to work through practices research with a focus not on dance per se, but on the choreographic, hosted by these two organisations, Dance Floor and Choreographic Lab, that drew me in. I was already making work driven by a choreographic sensibility, very often outside of dance and traditional dance-based contexts. Such a studentship was not an opportunity to build a professional practice. The research and academic agendas do not invite that, but this was an invitation to delve deep into my practice, to challenge and be challenged. I will outline one more complexity that such collaborative studentships understandably contain. Each is further complicated by an area of focus already defined by the host organisations, in this case, activating audiences, which, although wonderfully open, added a further layer to fold into the already complex mix. So, having offered a little of the context, I will share a little of the practice. I began from a genuinely open place of non-knowing. Later, to find Gaston Bachelard and his description of non-knowing as a difficult transcendence of knowledge. My initial proposal was typically maker-centered, something around those aha moments when something resonates that we want to stay with. As I allowed myself to begin to settle upon those moments in an attempt to find focus, I began to quieten and still. I will fold in here a further layer, my daily yin yoga practice. Yin yoga invites a staying in postures, a yielding or letting go, welcoming gravity, and provides an invitation to notice, to acknowledge. As the fascia relax, it takes time. It is slow, quiet, detailed work, attending to the minutiae. I seem to have been drawn to the minutiae forever in my work. I recognise that more than ever now as I emerge out of this period of study. But this newfound attention to detail was different. I moved towards a naming of these moments, these apparently still, or at least stiller, points in my choreographies. But like my yin yoga, as soon as I reached an edge, the ground shifted. I got bogged down for a while in an academically driven concern of all PhDs, one's contribution to the field, such a grandiose term. However, I remained committed to a daily practice and began to recognise that the stillness I was interested in wasn't passive, it was active. A deliberate not moving, not dancing, an active non-doing, a time when little or no external movement is visible to the outside eye. However, there is movement, sometimes a great deal of movement, inside, within, and at the edges of stillness. A moving towards and away from. This moving towards and away I came to mark, to name, as stilling. And this choosing not to move, this choosing not to move on to the next place or image is both an aesthetic and a political choice. Of course, T.S. Eliot had said it all 70 years ago through the four quartets, partly inspired by his attendance at performances of the Ballet Russe. Eliot writes rather beautifully of the still point of the turning world and argues,
Were it not for the still point, there would be no dance, and there is only the dance. Committed to working from the experiential, I made an invitation, and this is where my relationship with dance floor was critical. An invitation to 13 others, made up of dance floor staff, board members, and a handful of other makers to come and still with me. And through an embodied practice that led into a dialoguing, to reflect upon stillness and what it might mean to them. I set up a space in the dance floor studio, and over 3 weeks I facilitated a one-to-one practice that moved very gradually from the horizontal to the vertical. My participants were so generous. I learnt about stillness through their stories, prompted by my questions. They shared their experiences of stillness through a range of verbal and non-verbal ways. It was an exhausting process, face-to-face in the eventhood, but I endeavoured to remain open. Inevitably, a whole host of things came up, things I did not want to confront. Stilling brings you face-to-face with yourselves. The intimate studio practice was something entirely new to me. This being still together led me to a complex philosopher, one I would at the time have liked to have chosen not to engage with, but whose writing resonated so deeply with my thinking and practice, I could no longer ignore him. This gentle, slow, grounded studio practice led me to Martin Heidegger. For the German philosopher, our being in the world is only possible because of our own knowing of our own mortality. As mortals, our acknowledgement of the inevitability of our own death is significant because it cannot be separated from our understanding of our own being. Being is already in relationship to our own mortality, our own selves, and to others. Just as I would suggest, being still cannot help but point in some way at some point to its other, movement. For Heidegger, this notion of being as a human state should be considered through dwelling, and that which he names the fourfold, the earth, sky, mortals, and divinities. A little more on this later. Now to dwelling. Heidegger suggests that in order to build a space, any kind of space, properly, with due care and attention, we should come to this by dwelling. He explores the association between dwelling as a space for a home and suggests the one is not synonymous with the other. Just because a house may provide a roof over our heads does not mean that we dwell in it. I was already all too aware that just because I asked people to experience stillness, it did not mean that they would. Conversely, a place where we feel at home does not mean we stay there. For Heidegger, proper dwelling carries with it a necessity to value and care for those beings and things within our domain. It seemed to me that dwelling could be a useful way to enter the domain of stillness with the necessary care and attention. Significantly for Heidegger and my developing practice, the real plight for us as humans is that we have lost our ability to dwell, to exist in relation to the fourfold. Slowly, very slowly, Through a huge amount of questioning and through a simultaneous and consistent struggle with the difficulty of writing about such delicate states as stillness and stilling. I began to enter into what Bachelard has termed a slower ontology. Through dwelling with others in the studio, I found a way to approach stillness, and through stilling, we have been able to dwell. Such dwelling, initially grounded on the horizontal plane, had, however, allowed stories of stillness held in suspension to spring up. The connection between instants of stillness caught in suspension, springing up to surprise, resonated deeply with me. I saw its repercussions in the way one moment could lead in ways I could not have imagined to the next body of work. Indeed, it was the absolute uniqueness of each handstand Tom Wainwright performed here in the Bodies in Flight show Model Love, which acted as the creative spark that led me to working with elite and amateur gymnasts. Such interruptions in the midst of flow, instants made up of deliciously poor repetitions as Tom attempted, but could never succeed, to hold on to the exact same moment, with the expectation that at any point he could drop out of such a state and fall into something else. Or Jake Houtley's impossible task to keep the rings, actually called still rings, as still as possible whilst his body is held in a horizontal position here in a planche for as long as possible. During such moments, gymnasts are usually working hard to conceal movement. What drew my eye was all the tiny adjustments required just to try to hold such a still. I edged towards a title, one that might hold such a range of works and practices. I alighted upon still small acts. And perhaps more importantly, to the naming of a palette of stillnesses. And I began, rather gingerly at first, to articulate this to others as I prepared to make still moving, moving still. First, in the Arnolfini in Bristol, as part of a major AHRC-funded research project performing documents, and then on a much grander scale as part of Dance4's 2013 Dancing Galleries season, made for Nottingham Contemporary. The palette was made up of stillness as a letting go, stillness coupled with difficulty, stillness as a way of drawing attention to, and stillness held in suspension. Through a further invite, this time via email, I gathered together performers who were interested in exploring being still in performance, and then those with a mindful practice of their own. I was interested in how little was needed to draw attention, how, through the employment of stillness and stilling, the most ordinary of actions could be foregrounded, how we could develop strategies that would invite audiences and passers-by to notice, and perhaps even dwell in such stillnesses themselves. I developed a greater affinity with the dominant characteristics of each part of my palette. In practice, this allowed me to mix and move in between them with increased confidence, and this in turn offered me the ability to develop a range of rhythms and tones within the choreography. I was able to employ stillness and stilling to point to other places and people, to invite attention towards the extraordinary ordinary that makes up our everydays. And finally, through this practice, I found a way to move towards the tricky subject of activating audiences, as I began to relook at the complex blurring of roles between performers and spectators. I witnessed for myself how the employment of stillness can offer up an invitation, a space and time to engage audiences and passers-by within such live, face-to-face encounters, to demand attention, to slow us down, even to still. Concurrently, I found stillness and stilling in other works, most obviously Marina Abramovich's 2010 work, The Artist is Present. The influence of other makers was perhaps less explicit. I was hugely influenced by the work of Raymond Hoy and Laribo, first seen in Not Dance in the 1990s, with their propensity to employ stillness to invite us to look closer, to re-look, to confront ourselves in the spaces and times opened up, and to in fact challenge our very expectations of dance and what it should contain. And further back, to Cunningham, sitting still for Tacitus Dean's film, Merce Cunningham performs stillness in 3 movements, to Martha Graham, Doris Humphrey and Isadora Duncan, and their various pauses in between, and particularly to Ruth St. Dennis, who really understood stillness as part of her dances. And even further back to the swans of the Corps de Ballet, bent over in ballets such as The Sleeping Beauty in the 1890s, their stillness pointing to the movement of the prima ballerina. And alongside all this, I returned to the dream walks and began to unpack further the rhythm set up between walking and stilling, between immediating and dwelling. I looked again at presumptions around active performer, passive spectator. Fueled by Jacques Rancière's Emancipated Spectator, I reapproached activating audiences and how looking has historically been placed in opposition to knowing, acting aligned to moving around, being physical, whilst audiences remain seated and passive. Of course, we must not oversimplify this. Just because audiences move around, they can still be passive receivers. My work and the stillnesses within it opened up spaces and times to look and see from different places. Placing stillness and stilling within dance performance was and is an invitation to put oneselves in the frame. I took all this and more into the process of making new, bespoke versions of Dreamwalk in 2 vastly different locations. Firstly, in the Derbyshire market town of Wirksworth. It was in this garden in Wirksworth, a small walled private garden on the highest point of the walk, that I realised my desire to find a place where we could dwell together, where I felt most aware of myself, my fellow collaborators, and the other others, the auditor walkers, in the fourfold. As we stepped aside from the everyday and performer Graham Rose lay on the earth looking up to the sky and beyond, his intense stillness inviting the auditor walkers space to rest and time to take a breath, to share in the many scents of the late September flowers and to perhaps become aware of their own selves, maybe their own stillings. We were folding in memories, lived experiences of local residents into the work, and I was embracing Greek anthropologist Nadia Saramatakis' beautifully crafted 1994 writing, "The Senses Still," understanding, as if for the first time, both the space for memories that stillness can open up and the stilling that remembering can invoke. As I stand here before you now, so close to completion, I see this studentship as the most challenging and difficult part of my professional life to date. I can only imagine how this perception may change. Perhaps this is due in part to the slippery and confrontational nature of my chosen topic. My insistence upon the embodied practice remaining at the heart of the process led to a demand to develop practices new to me. Alongside this, I was taking fresh research into very public situations. Still Moving, Moving Still was the first piece of choreographically driven work placed in Nottingham Contemporary outside of the studio space. Dream Walk in Skegness marked the first collaboration between Dance Floor and the So Festival. The body, mind and dialoguing practice, so important to me, did not even in the end have its own chapter in the thesis. Whole works such as Gymnast, which began so wholly and completely from an investigation of stillness, remained in my writing simply as an analysis of that one still image of Jake on the rings. I had to let go of, or at least background, such complex collaborative endeavours in order to wrestle with my own individual flight. Being such a natural and practiced collaborator, this did not always come easy. I learnt the hard way through failed attempts that the process of disseminating stillness and stilling is so very different from the process itself. I still cannot articulate satisfactorily enough the incontestable moment when stilling tips into stillness, or when suspension becomes so comfortable that one can dwell in it. Perhaps boundaries always afford such leeway. Perhaps, like the boundaries of our bodies, stillness and stilling just slows us down. And that is its greatest gift, and sometimes its most difficult invitation. As for my contribution to the field, well, I still remain shy on this one. I hoped to put stillness and stilling more firmly on the choreographic map. I have made a case for creating spaces and times for stillness in a range of contexts. I hope through my work and the sharing of it, I have invited other makers, audiences, and commissioners to rethink and re-experience stillness in choreographically led work, and in doing so approach anew what activating audiences might really involve. Such subtle work demands particular sensitivity and care in its staging and programming. However, the creation of such openings can only ever be a carefully constructed invitation for spectators and passers-by to choose to step into if they wish. I offer one final invitation as I remember with gratitude the absolute and permanent shift the embracing of dwelling as a process has had upon my practice. I will end with the final scene from Dream Walk in Skegness. The audience have walked through the busy streets, dwelling in a few places along the way. We pick it up here 33 minutes into a 35-minute show. They have finally stepped onto the beach. This clip ends with words uttered by Joyce Oates, gathered through an invitation to share her experiences of childhood holidays, and who, upon hearing the title Dream Walk, left us with words that we could not have even imagined. For me, a return to Sara, whose work in the senses still I just touched upon earlier, and through her to the Greek meaning of nostalgia, an absolute aching for.
My dream is to walk again. I dream I could stand and walk again. We take it all for granted that we can get up in the morning and can do just what we like. But when it's taken from you, you realise how much you're missing. I mean, I used to walk everywhere. I used to organise walks. And I used to go swimming, and I can't do neither now.
Thank you.
So, thank you for coming back to join us in the conversation. I think what we're going to do, because of time, is to maybe just reflect on what we've heard, and an opportunity maybe also for the two of you to be in conversation with each other about what you've heard of each other, and maybe some of the commonalities and resonances in both of your research practices that have been drawn out through the project. Vida, I don't know if you wanted to kick things off.
Yeah,
we'll start from there, see what comes out.
I was busily in thinking about today and then in listening, sort of pulling out thoughts about key threads. But I think firstly what I wanted to just note was how incredibly honoured I feel from listening to those of having been part of that work and its genesis and its richness, and having gone back to the research proposal that was written by Jane Bacon, who was the other co-supervisor, myself and Paul 5, maybe 6 years ago, because it takes so long for the HRC to make up their minds, how much the research process, and inevitably research processes, I guess, go beyond anything you can envisage when you write proposals. And so there's something about that in looking at the things that it says here about what we thought we'd try and do, and how they do that and also do so much more and become so particular and so nuanced, and how research has that ability to speak to a broad issue but in these very specific and nuanced ways, which I think was really clear for me listening to you today, which was really nice, and I feel hugely honoured to have been part of that, which was really lovely, quite emotional. Because it's our kind of first public outing since the completion of both of them, so that's really fantastic. In terms of general things that were coming up for me when listening were things about the relationship to archive in dance, and what do we mean by a relationship to archive. And I guess that resonates for me because back in the Not Dance Festival this year I was having a conversation with Rosemary Butcher about that, and so the different types of relationship to our archives and our own histories in different ways that both of you touch on in different ways. Something about collaboration in its broadest sense. This is obviously a collaboratively funded award, but equally both of you as artists are working collaboratively, and there's also something about how collaboration is both in the work but also this kind of dialogic relationship with the theories you're dealing with and coming to and from, which you might think of as a collaboration in some way. So those different kind of modes of collaboration that are attached to the work. I was really interested, I think there was a little conversation went on next to me when the Jerome Bell piece was up of, did you see the work? And I was really interested in listening to, and actually when you talk about your own works as well as when you're talking about the works of others, how does it feel both as writers of the work, how do you find a voice for your own work and for that of others that feels right for the research, true to the work, and how does that sit with an audience that's seen that work and programmed that work? How does it really resonate? What is it that we grasp and what do we miss in this finding the specifics that we're interested in when you're doing a particular piece of your own research that can't possibly encompass everything? But what do you also then get that you wouldn't have got without that particular perspective? So that was strong for me in listening. All sorts of in-betweennesses, which has been a really important word for Sara in her work throughout. I don't think you used it actually today.
My students have banned me for saying reflection, resonance, in between.
But that I think is, again, I guess is part of collaboration as well, of what are the kind of in-betweennesses of those places, and how do you be in between all these different contexts, agendas, ideas, and blur them interestingly and purposefully. They were some things coming up for me, and I'll probably do for now.
I think there's also something for me about audiences and spectating was so present in everything that you were talking about. And partly because of my knowledge of the works that you're talking and referencing, both your own, but also the others. And there's something about revealing through the invitation. So something about being clear about what the invitation is, whether that be a score and a knowledge about whether the score is present, and then also an invitation to dwell and spend time. They feel like very, very clear invitations. And so for me, I was interested in that as a mode of practice, but then also a method of activating and deepening a dialogue with an audience about choreography. And I think that's what's resonating clearly for me through both in many different ways. I think it's interesting we were just very quickly sharing a surprise, I suppose, about the notion of dance for, not dance, having history and being in the past in that way, because it feels so present and so much of the work still feels incredibly fresh in terms of its perspective. And then fascinated, I suppose, particularly Rosanna, about the focus on a particular time. And then, so between the two of you, somehow I feel that a line of inquiry through the organisation's work curatorially has been articulated in some way, which I think is a really, really subtle but very beautiful thing that's emerged. It was quite a special outcome of an unexpected outcome. Yeah, I'm not sure. And then again, I suppose I should just acknowledge that huge privilege of being part of many, many deep and quite mind-bending conversations that have not only, I feel, hopefully informed your research, but ultimately are deeply informing the way in which our organisation feels has an attention to what we're now doing. So thank you for that.
I guess that's the loop as well, that it would be really lovely to hear from you, because that's the stuff that has as yet been unspoken.
Mm.
The impact of our inquiry, really.
Do you want some of that now? I suppose the impact of the inquiry has been about, it takes many different forms, so trying to be succinct. So I can clearly see that there's been an impact on the environment in which we, and an attention to the environments in which we place work. And I think the trying to understand a language in which helps invite an audience into a particular place with a piece of choreography, or a practice, or a conversation. I think that there's been, also for me, particularly in the research that I'm interested in, as a presenter and commissioner, I'm aware of building connection to, is it an archive? Is it a memory? Is it understanding a path between what we're now doing and what we were doing? And so through programming, trying to ensure that what we're doing is being respectful and enabling an audience to understand a longevity of practice for an artist, and also a range of practices, and for Dance 4. And although that was part of my pitch around coming to Dance 4, actually, that's been really present since a range of conversations that have taken place. And also, I suppose there's a fascination in all of those works fundamentally that sit in the beginning of Not Dance. Absolutely informed me and my interest in my professional practice to date. And so it's been wonderful to be able to have those present and that period of time more present through this project. I suppose I could go on and on, but that's a little bit of where I am with that.
So I guess, something that is fundamental to both of the projects and fundamental to the whole reason for being for Dance 4, it seems to me, is actually being about choreographic research and what on earth we mean by choreographic research, and why is it not just doing choreography, and what is entailed in that, that is both obviously fundamental to both of these projects, that it comes out of, it is generated through and shared in choreographic processes. I wondered if you wanted to say anything about the choreographic in that sense, and the choreography as research.
Yes. Well, I think one of the first things I would say is when I'm using the word choreographic. The word choreographic it's an adjective, and I talk about choreography, so I talk about artworks. So you can explore something choreographically, which doesn't necessarily produce an artwork. So I first of all make that distinction. So I talk about choreographic works and processes for choreographic works that lead to works. So that's one thing. And then do you mean more specifically what is the choreographic kind of thing?
No, I was actually thinking about the getting at the because of Dance 4's interest in having a research agenda,
yes,
that these projects have a very particular place in that research agenda, it seems to me.
Sure.
In a kind of more in-depth and long process than most choreographic research projects can possibly do.
Yeah.
So people carry them themselves, choreographers carry them themselves, but don't necessarily have that kind of, the visibility of that quite so present.
And interestingly, I think that the way that I feel I've approached the whole thing, the whole studentship, is as a choreography of all these different elements. I can't imagine how else I could have done that, because all the time there was and it's partly to do with collaboration as well, Vida. It felt like it was really important to find a space for these different voices. So people I collaborated with, people from Dance 4 that were there in the studio at that really important moment for me. You know, as I said, it didn't really feature in the thesis in the way that I had imagined it when I was in the studio, but it was absolutely fundamental to me finding the direction for this. So in a way, if I think about my role as a choreographer, which I see as about piecing materials together, and whatever those materials may be, and I think about that in relationship to taking on the role of piecing a thesis together, a thesis being all the practice and the writing, the sensibility is the same in a way. It's about interweaving all these different voices, and that feels really, really important. And having that presence there, really.
I think another aspect of choreography that was something that you said about your work, that it's not really through dance. You said that when you were speaking, that you've been making work that wasn't about dance, and I would say actually, well, the works I've made in the context of the thesis are also not dance. However, the scores can be danced, but they can also be scores for drawing. So I think that the way we're talking about choreography is choreography in what is now called an expanded field, and that seems to be just, we're not even saying that, but we're already kind of assuming that choreography is no longer just dance. But perhaps we do need to say it in different ways again and again. And then when choreography is no longer just dance, then maybe there is a weaving and a putting of material together, but the question of material can become very elusive, or even ephemeral in itself once you embrace that possibility of choreographic work in an expanded field. We've always used the word choreography around, choreographing a dinner party, Well, then it depends on the context, whether it's a work of art, but we kind of decide who's going to sit next to each other. So in everyday life, we do a kind of choreography, but when we're doing when we're making work as artists that we give the word choreography to, then there is something more particular, which is something about contextualising the thing as art. You could call your dinner party art, of course, which is kind of going on slightly. It's art if I say so, as it were. Duchamp.
Again, keeps popping up, doesn't it? Don't hear from him for a while and then comes along 2 nights on their own.
I wonder whether either of you have anything to say about choreography not necessarily having to, or being perceived to belong just to dance. In the dance world, I don't use that hesitate, in a kind of nervous way.
You were doing it with jazz hands at the same time.
It's problematic because is it problematic because of how we then enable and have a conversation with an audience about choreography when potentially or dance when it's being appropriated by other practices, and I'm excited by that, and I'm also a little bit nervous about it because of having a mandate for dance. So I wondered if you have thoughts.
You see, my feeling about that is, and I can't divorce myself from the process I've just been through. So there's all of that that's first and foremost in my mind and coming out my lips, I guess. But for me, the problem is about how the work that is choreographically driven is then cared for. For me, that is the only issue.
Yeah.
That if people can articulate that there is a choreographic concern to the work and you approach commissioners or whoever it may be with that in mind and you're engaging in that dialogue, then for me it's about how do you look after that work that's choreographically driven when it's perhaps not in a theatre. When it's put into an art gallery where front of house staff aren't briefed appropriately to engage with it, or whatever it is, it's about how it's cared for. That's what matters, I think.
I do feel that there is a potential sort of risk for dance when choreography is let free from dance. Although my work is absolutely, the work I've been doing the last few years is free from dance in many ways. But I trained in dance and I see myself as a choreographer coming from dance. And I think there is, the positive, so visual artists working choreographically and presenting work in the same kinds of spaces where choreographers coming from dance backgrounds are wanting to show work. And increasingly in the expanded field of choreography that's coming from dance, there is this sense that we want to move out of the theatre. There's lots of work that's no longer theatre. This kind of relationship with the audience. So the positive meeting of the sort of visual art world and the dance world is the increased sharing of thinking and talking. And I mentioned when I did the presentation about dance catching up with visual art. Visual art's very aware of where it's coming from. Visual artists, they're generally speaking, there's many visual art magazines. People working in the visual arts can be very articulate about what they're doing and acknowledge where they're coming from. I think it's not been practiced so much in dance. I don't know if you agree with that, but I don't see, we had New Dance magazine in the 80s, and then that went. We had Dance Theatre Journal, and that went. There are very few places where a kind of national, international discourse on dance can happen. Of course it can happen online now, but there are no really vibrant spaces where it is happening or where people are going. And I think this puts dance at a slight disadvantage when it goes into visual art world. But so what's the really positive thing? I think that work that's made from dance artists in the choreographic field is different, has a different quality, which comes from this working with the body-mind actually, the sensitivity to space, to presence in space, the qualities that dance-trained people bring to choreographic work is different, and the way that they, generally speaking, operate with bodies is different. So there's something about that needs to be. I think it would be, say, dance floor. You have a remit to do with dance, so something about that.
And I'm also
what's special about it?
I'm also just nervous, and I know you're not saying this, but I'm nervous about us speaking as if there isn't the history. That suddenly, in the last 5 years, dancers have been making work outside of theatres. We know that's not true, and that the critical discourse hasn't been there. I think we've got to be so careful of falling into those traps, because the critical discourse has been there in different ways. Dancers have moved out of theatres, a long time ago. It's like me approaching stillness and going, ooh, where's that? Oh, how about the ballet? How about Swan Lake? How about Sleeping Beauty? Yeah, the corps de ballet were told how to use stillness, So,
but maybe
so
not
it's
with
just
the same political agenda.
But it's about making sure that we're aware of that, making sure that that's on the agenda.
And that is obviously one of the absolute necessities that placing dance research into an academic context requires of you, in a way that an artist making their own work may or may not wish to attend to those histories. And they might be present for them in all sorts of ways, but they don't necessarily have a requirement to make those explicit. Whereas a research agenda absolutely requires you to situate yourself in the moment, in the field, and how your practice is dialogue with those things. And it is a necessity of that process.
And was a very key part of our conversation very early on, that drew us into this collaborative relationship. Coming across so much work that doesn't seemingly want to acknowledge where it's come from or what it's informed by, and acknowledging reading and teaching and questioning emerging artists, for instance, that have no sense of where their practice is coming from. And so at the heart of this, in some way, trying to understand what has gone before in the context of not dance. How is that bearing some relation to a practice which is taking place now? In the time left, are there questions, musings, reflections?
Invitation.
I feel I should say something, although I find it very hard to articulate these things, but weirdly what you said, Rosanna, about the difference between dance and choreography, in 23 years, I don't think I've ever thought as much as I have about that as I have done in the last 5 minutes. It's very interesting. but I have lived through a dance floor, endless kind of going, but that's not, what is this? This isn't dance. What, not dance is called not dance. We didn't invent it. Not dance predated dance floor, remember? And it was called not dance as a kind of joke you know, you come to nut dance, you go, well, that's not dance, and it's hilarious still, you know. But actually, the minute you say it's choreography, well, actually, that is different. And I don't think we speak about, internally we speak about choreography in that way. Mm-hmm. I was thinking, you know, I'm thinking a lot about the centre we're going to be moving to next year with new workspaces, about making, about giving artists space. You know, and the minute you call it a dance centre, it brings all these expectations. And those big studios in France, which has this big national, you know, kind of national grid of centres, they're called choreographic centres. They're not called dance centres. And so what you expect to come out of those is Jerome Bell and is Xavier Lemar. That's where those guys have come from. And so I'm kind of going through this huge revelation.
Yeah. The dance does come out of those places.
Yeah, of course. And dance comes out of here. Yeah, and of course Dance Floor has done lots of things that are dance.
Yeah.
But it is
and do we have,
it is an opening, isn't it? It's a different way. It says, I am opening up to a range of practices and range.
And do we have a commitment to dance? We have a commitment to dance because it's in our name and because it's a department of the Arts Council that you have to fit in with the, you know, as Nigel Tran knew, is endlessly being told he couldn't be funded as a dance person because he wasn't dancing. You know, is that Dance Floor's genuine commitment? Is it to dance or is it to choreographic practice? Is it choreography? Because so many of the pieces we've presented, I mean, you know, you joke about a dinner party. We just presented a show in dance called The Dinner Party. It was a choreographed dinner party. We present it in the festival. It, you know, absolutely makes sense.
Can I throw something else into your mix of the choreographic?
Don't blow my mind on
The choreographic is, in its Greek, dance writing.
Yes.
Graphic.
Right,
As in, you know, the graphite. And so there is, in that, of how much is actually Dance Floor's interest. Also, in its opening towards discourse, also about dance languaging and dance writing, and the space for that, that is different from saying we're about dancing. They're really, really interesting. And listening, I was really aware that we're seeing the visuals of the work, which were actually beautifully documented by, wonderful to say, absolutely beautiful documents of them. But equally that you're speaking of the work and speaking of it and knowing that all these different modes of personal writing, you know, densely theoretical writing, practice that audiences engage with, as well as video documentation, are all part of the modes through which this research is taken place through and disseminated through. And that being really important to a rich ecology of dance researching, of choreographic researching, if we're going to be specific.
I think the other thing that's really important to me, though, and it's come up a lot throughout the evening, is that ultimately the live experience is what stays with you. And I mean, I don't read a lot about dance. I don't watch a lot of dance on video. It doesn't really do a lot for me, in all honesty. And the reason I think when Paul and I were talking about the fact that some of those things feel so, that they don't feel like history, they feel like yesterday, because you can feel it. You can feel the sensation of sitting in the Bonington Gallery watching Jerome Bell, and the effect it had on you because you were there in the space. If you'd have watched it on video, you'd never have captured that. So, and the dance writing we did when we sat live and wrote about dance in your projection project. That means more to me than an article I would read and go. I mean, that's me. But I think Dance Floor's kept that in its history as well, is always going for the live experience of being on Dreamwalk or being in backlit and not feeling that just presenting stuff on video or documenting it and archiving and that's okay. It's like, no, you have to be there. And whether it's in a theatre or whether it's not in a theatre, you can do. We've had stuff that's just as experimental, having no dance in it in this theatre many times, as well as we have out in Market Square on a beach. So it's not about the context, as it were, but all those things change the environment.
Any others before we?
I've just enjoyed. I didn't know. I came sort of because I know Sara. I didn't know anything.
But what that cut does is stop a lot of what used to happen of the kind of play across the boundary, the sort of vagueness in the contribution in terms of course, what the kind of bodily knowledge that builders have of working with their materials that architects kind of like to think they sort of have. They kind of know what the builders are doing because they couldn't do it themselves. But they have enough understanding of it that they can design and kind of include that in their design. And I guess it's not quite the same, and you don't have quite that same legal kind of boundary between the two.
Well, I think that question could exist. So, for example, Schreib's the Thomas Lehmann score, is really, so the structural elements are really fixed, it's absolutely fixed. And so, which is that the timing, there's a minute, everything's split into minutes, there's some slight variations in that, and there's a sequence across the space, so one group comes on, they move along to this, the next group comes on, they move along to the other, that one moves there and that one moves there. So you have this procession going across the space. So that's one element of structure, which is to do with time and space. So the spatial temporal structuring is absolute. What it's filled with, the choreographers has instructions for that also, and that's where they make their own choices. So in a way, that's where they're bringing in their equivalent to your builder, understanding the materials and their maybe aesthetic, what they feel like doing in response to those instructions. But it's held very firmly by the structure in space and time. And then with my own instructions and perception frames, it's not at all. What it's held by is the particular frame for attention. And that includes how you attend to space. So there are different ways of attending spatially, and that's written into instructions. It's very complex to have spoken of it now. So there can be an intention here, here, and wider. So, and then it depends how many people are around, what that then feels like, which will have a consequence on this attention. So if I'm in an empty space, that's a different experience, which so the experience of giving attention within that instruction is different if I'm alone in the space or if you're all here, for example. So it goes into a slightly different realm, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, interesting. I think the notion of the gaps, how you inhabit or how you fill the gaps in the instruction is really interesting, because almost by definition you can't really ever capture that. You can't kind of record it. If you could, it would be in the instructions. I guess, or the temptation would be to keep on.
Yeah, and in a way, what I've tried to do is construct gaps. So, and in a way, there's no absolute, but there is a very particular, because like force trying to be set up rather than firm structure, like or Lehmann's gaps, they're clear.
But in a way, I think we're both, like many other makers, playing with what is this structure that opens up a space and time for others to be in, including audiences. So that's the kind of next layer, really. And when and where that happens in relationship to your invitation to open up is another whole debate. But there is a misnomer that, I do improvise in terms of when I'm making work. Almost all the choreography at some point comes through improvisation, but there is a misnomer that improvisation is kind of, free, and actually very often there's a very clear structure that holds that in place, whatever it may be.
I was quite surprised that nobody said the word improvisation this morning, either of you, and it's quite interesting to me.
Absolutely. Even though the movement is not defined, it's absolutely not improvisation.
Okay. that did come up to me, that you didn't mention that word, and that was a question.
And what's interesting is it's purely anecdotal, but from conversations, the word improvisation, when given to an audience, is not helpful.
Exactly.
And so it's interesting then in the dialogue and discourse that you've been having through this research around activating audiences, particularly, that word isn't present.
And it sort of has a carelessness associated with it in a way, and it's the absolute antithesis of that.
And an aesthetic associated with it too, I think.
Yeah.
We should finish because of time. So also leaves me just to say congratulations on completing. It's been fantastic, and well done to both of you, and for your insights and sharing your knowledge. That was fantastic. Thank you, Lida, for making it all possible too. And thank you to you for coming.
Thank you, James.
Yeah, thank you, James. Absolutely.
Awesome.
So, we draw it to a close. Thank you very much.